Nancy and I'm here this week to answer a question for Chronic Connections Ask the Spoonie segment. This week's question is from Charlotte Elizabeth and she wants to know how to deal with a diagnosis. In most chronic illness circumstances, it takes an incredibly long time to be diagnosed. It can take months to receive a diagnosis, but it can also take years, and that's from personal experience. It did take a long time. This is a time where you're usually passed from doctor to doctor, hospital to hospital, and you kind of lose a lot of hope and faith. It is really difficult, and I completely understand how people can get really low when they're diagnosed with an illness. I was definitely one of those people. Receiving a diagnosis is so scary, and it can be incredibly frightening and intimidating because you wait so long for one. When you've spent years and years and years going to different doctors and different hospitals and feeling like you're getting nowhere, receiving a diagnosis is just like finding a needle in a haystack. It feels impossible, so when it actually happens, you are so relieved and there's a release of pressure off of your shoulders and off of the shoulders of your family. However, I always feel like that's kind of the initial response, and then reality hits home, which is why I call it the reality response. With the reality response, the diagnosis really starts to hit home. You kind of go home and you don't understand what's happening, why you're experiencing so much pain. You wonder if things are ever going to get better, you wonder if you're going to become disabled. Everything kind of runs through your mind and you feel incredibly scared and overwhelmed. Initially, when you are diagnosed with a chronic illness, there's a lot of information that's bombarded your way, and I feel like we kind of all want to run and resort to Dr. Google, which is completely the wrong way to go because you just end up scaring yourself. And I know that a lot of people believe that knowledge is power, which in some circumstances it can be, but it can also cause you to really reflect and to start panicking and worrying about something that might not have even been part of your story so far. I think it's really important to just take your illness and your pain and your symptoms off of your own back and to not run to Google and diagnose yourself with something that's even more frightening. Sometimes it's really easy to focus on all of the negatives of receiving a diagnosis, but you have to find some of the light within the dark, and you have to know that you are fortunate enough to be diagnosed, that you're fortunate enough to even have one doctor who understands what you're going through. Seeing the good in the bad really helps you to ground yourself and to realise that actually you're not alone in all of this. Chronic illness does give you a lot of limits within yourself, especially physical limits, because you are in so much pain. However, I think it's so important to not neglect yourself, and this is something that I'm really waking up to this year. A diagnosis can make you feel like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, and this is why it's so important to have people that you can talk to. Whether they be medical professionals or your family and friends, it's so important that you are able to reach out to somebody and let them know how you're feeling through all of this. I think that communication is something that's really beneficial when you are diagnosed with a chronic illness, especially with friends. Friends tend to not understand really what's happening within your life, and to be fair, you don't really understand what's happening a lot of the time. I feel like it's important to not push people away. People, if they're genuine enough, are going to want to be there for you, rain or shine. Your life does completely change with a diagnosis, but through all of this, it's really important to know that you are definitely not alone. When I first started my blog, I genuinely believed that I was one of the only young people out there who lived with chronic illness. It wasn't true. I was proved very, very, very wrong. There are so many people out there who are fighting similar battles to yourself, and it's so important to keep that in the forefront of your mind when you're feeling low with illness. Adapting to your diagnosis can be incredibly draining, especially when you're experiencing such high levels of pain. However, I also feel that this is something that everybody goes through, and that those with chronic illness will completely understand where you're coming from. This is truly going to be a lifelong process, but it doesn't have to be really scary because along the way you definitely grow as a person and you begin to understand your limits more and you understand your doctors more and you're able to communicate a lot better. From a hindsight point of view, I think it's really important to not allow a diagnosis to neglect who you are as a person. I think that pain can do that to us. We kind of compromise who we are and what we enjoy to do because we are so frightened of making the pain worse. And with the diagnosis, I really feel like I personally compromised who I was for the longest time, probably up to this year, bearing in mind I've been diagnosed for 6 years now. I think it's important to know that it is okay to be scared of receiving the diagnosis, and it is okay to feel frightened and anticipate what's going to happen in your life. I think that most people that have received a chronic illness diagnosis have been there. Sometimes it's really difficult to be incredibly young and receive a diagnosis because you do feel like your world is ending before it's even begun. And I think it's really important to remember that actually your life is still just starting, you just have an illness. And although it's incredibly difficult to live with and cope with, you will be fine and you will be able to cope. I believe that personally I will probably have to deal with the diagnosis for the rest of my life. It's something that I always want to work on because I don't want it to be my entire life. I don't want it to control me, and I don't want it to drag me down. As valid as receiving a chronic illness diagnosis is, I think it's so important to remember that it's not the core of your being, which is really silly to say when we experience pain 365 days of the year, but what I mean is that it's not who you are as a person. You have a diagnosis, you have an illness, you might have 5 illnesses, you might have 15 illnesses, but it's definitely not who you are. It's just a part of you, and it's a part that you're going to have to learn to live with, and it's a part that other people are going to have to accept too. I don't think that many of us believe that we would ever be in the position of receiving a diagnosis of a chronic illness, but because it's happened, you just have to adapt, and you will find a way to adapt. It might not be similar to your friend, or it might not be how a book says that you have to cope, but you will find a way to cope. And this might change throughout your life when you go through different life changes, but you will definitely find a way to cope because it is the only choice that you have. You can't give up just because you're diagnosed with an illness. You just can't. That's it from me this week. Thank you to Denise for letting me come here on Chronic Connections YouTube channel. I hope I've been able to help even one person. Thank you. Bye.
Today's question comes to us from an anonymous source. What can you do if you have something to do but you know you don't have enough spoons for it?